He dragged the woman into the bathroom, sure that no one would ever know, and that he could do whatever he wanted. But just a few seconds later, he realized who he had touched. Subscribe to the channel and comment below where you're watching this video from. The wind off Lake Michigan carried the faint scent of salt and cold metal as dusk settled over the small coastal town north of Chicago. In the grand banquet hall of the Old Veterans Club, lights shimmered across crystal glasses and polished wood, and conversations buzzed beneath the muted brass of a military band. Banners bearing unit insignias lined the walls, reminders of decades of service and sacrifice. At the center of it all stood Gina O'Kelly, poised behind a mahogany podium, her calm voice steady over the hum of the crowd. She spoke without notes, her tone gentle but unwavering, the kind that made people lean in despite themselves. She talked about dignity, not as a word reserved for ceremonies, but as something every veteran deserved after leaving the battlefield. She spoke of compassion, not as weakness, but as strength that sustains a community long after the medals lose their shine. And when she mentioned the Foundation's mission to support veterans who had suffered from domestic violence or discrimination, the room grew quieter, the clinking of cutlery fading into stillness. When the applause came, it was polite at first, then grew warmer, genuine. Many of the older soldiers nodded in respect, yet not all faces in the audience shared that sentiment. At one of the round tables near the bar sat Major Richard Hunt, his uniform immaculate, his chest heavy with ribbons, his eyes sharp with an expression that mixed arrogance and amusement. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, muttering something to the lieutenant beside him. The younger officer chuckled awkwardly, unwilling to echo the major's disdain too loudly in public. After the ceremony ended, guests drifted toward the reception area. Gina was surrounded by well-wishers, women who admired her courage, men who thanked her for her efforts to help veterans find jobs, therapy, or simply a sense of belonging. Her poise never faltered. She had long learned how to navigate admiration that could easily turn condescending. She was used to eyes watching her, some with respect, some with skepticism, and a few with resentment she could always feel before she saw. It was only when the crowd thinned that she noticed Major Hunt making his way toward her. His steps were measured, his posture rigid in a way that looked rehearsed rather than natural. His smile was too wide, his handshake too firm. "Mrs. Norris," he began, deliberately using her husband's name as if her own identity didn't matter. "Impressive speech. I must admit, I didn't expect a show like that. Quite emotional." "Thank you, Major," she replied calmly. "I'm glad it reached you." "Oh, it reached me all right," he smirked, "though I'm not sure emotions are what build strong armies, but perhaps I'm old-fashioned." "I think empathy and strength can coexist," she said. "They usually do in real heroes." His smile stiffened. "In my experience, emotions make people weak, and weakness is dangerous, especially when it's given a microphone." She studied him, refusing to look away. Maybe strength is learning when not to use power. For a moment, his jaw clenched, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. The kind of contempt that doesn't flare up suddenly, but lives there, waiting. Then with a forced chuckle, he leaned closer. "You've got quite the tongue, ma'am. Be careful where you use it. Cameras make everyone polite." He lowered his voice. "But off camera, the world's less forgiving." Gina's lips barely moved when she replied, "Threats sound small, Major, no matter who makes them." He straightened, mask of composure returning. "Of course. Enjoy the rest of your evening." His tone made the words sound like an insult wrapped in courtesy. As he walked away, she exhaled slowly. The people around her resumed their chatter, unaware of the cold residue the conversation had left behind. She smiled through it, thanked a few more guests, and waited until the last of them had left before gathering her things. Outside, the night was still and cold. The parking lot glowed under harsh yellow lights. Her driver had gone to bring the car around, but the minutes stretched and she grew impatient. She decided to walk the short distance to the lot herself, heels tapping on the wet pavement. The world seemed empty except for the whisper of wind and the rhythmic hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. She was halfway across the lot when she heard footsteps behind her. Slow, deliberate, heavy. She turned, her heart tightening just slightly. Major Hunt emerged from the shadows, his tie loosened, his jacket unbuttoned, his face set in that same smirk that now looked predatory. "Leaving already?" he asked casually, though his voice carried the edge of command. "I have an early morning tomorrow." She forced calm into her tone. "If you'll excuse me." "I think you owe me another conversation," he said, stepping closer. "You embarrassed me back there." "That was never my intention." "Wasn't it?" He took another step. "You women think you can humiliate men in public and walk away smiling?" Gina's pulse quickened, but she kept her stance firm. "I think this discussion is over." He reached out suddenly, fingers clamping around her wrist. The grip was tight, the kind meant to prove dominance rather than make contact. "Major," she said quietly, "let go of my arm." He smiled wider. "Let's have this talk where the cameras don't see everything, huh? You'll find I'm a good listener when I'm in private." She tried to twist free, but his hold tightened. He leaned in, the smell of alcohol heavy on his breath. "You shouldn't play with fire, sweetheart." Her phone slipped from her hand as she struggled, falling to the pavement with a sharp crack. For a fraction of a second, the screen lit up, displaying the emergency SOS signal, a small red dot that began transmitting her location. Hunt didn't notice. He yanked her toward the dimly lit maintenance corridor beside the hall. Beyond it, an old public restroom stood half concealed by the fence and a row of dumpsters. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of waves against the docks. "Let go of me," Gina said again, louder this time. "No one's watching," he sneered. "Let's see how confident you are without an audience." He shoved the restroom door open with his shoulder and forced her inside. The harsh fluorescent light flickered above them. The door banged shut, echoing against the tiled walls. Outside, the parking lot was once again silent. A phone lay on the cold asphalt, its cracked screen glowing faintly for a few seconds longer before fading to black. But the signal had already been sent. Miles away in the quiet of his Texas ranch home, Chuck Norris's phone vibrated once, then again. On the screen, a small red notification appeared beneath his wife's name. "Emergency signal activated. Location, North Shore Veterans Club." He looked at it for exactly 2 seconds, then reached for his jacket. The night outside was dark and windless as he started the car. He didn't speed. He didn't need to. And somewhere far ahead, in that flickering restroom light, Gina O'Kelly took a deep breath and prepared herself to face what was coming next. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the restroom mingled with the shallow rhythm of Gina's breathing. The air smelled of cleaning solution and damp concrete. The door behind her had shut with a hollow clang, and for a few seconds the sound had hung in the air like a verdict. Richard Hunt stood between her and the exit, his broad shoulders blocking the narrow path to freedom. He wasn't shouting. That would have required emotion, and his cruelty had none. Instead, his voice was calm, deliberate, and soaked in contempt. "You know," he said, taking a step closer, "women like you think you can talk down to men because the world's gotten soft. Back in my unit, no one would have tolerated that tone." Gina didn't move. She watched his eyes, the way his pupils dilated slightly, reading his posture, the way her husband had taught her to do when assessing danger. "Keep your voice level," he had said once. "Make them believe you're calm, even if your pulse is screaming." Her heart was beating fast enough to make her hands tremble, but she forced her breath to even out. "This isn't the Army, Major," she said, her tone quiet but firm. "And I'm not one of your subordinates." He chuckled, stepping closer until the smell of whiskey and sweat pressed against her. "That's right. You're just a politician's wife, pretending to fix soldiers' lives with words and charity dinners." "I'm not pretending anything," she said. "And you're drunk." That broke his smirk for a moment. His jaw flexed. "You think you can talk to me like that?" He slammed a fist against the metal wall beside her, the sound metallic and sharp. The vibration ran through the floor, but she didn't flinch. That seemed to irritate him even more. "You think you're better than me because of your husband? Because you stand on stages and talk about compassion?" "I don't think I'm better than anyone," she said softly. "But I do know you need help." He laughed, low and ugly. "Help? That's rich." His hand shot out again, grabbing her arm above the elbow. The pressure made her gasp, not from fear but from pain. She could feel his fingers digging into her skin, the heat of his anger radiating through his grip. "You've got a lot to learn about the real world, Mrs. Norris." Outside, the night stretched empty and cold. A car door shut somewhere in the distance. Tires rolled over gravel. Inside the restroom, Hunt tightened his hold and shoved her backward, forcing her toward the wall near the sinks. "You know what your problem is? You talk too much. Maybe you should learn to listen." Gina's mind wasn't on his words anymore. It was on the phone she dropped outside. She remembered the brief flash of red across the cracked screen. The signal she hoped had reached Chuck. The device was programmed to send a precise GPS coordinate the moment the emergency alert activated. It wasn't the first time she'd needed the feature, but it was the first time she prayed it would work fast enough. "Major," she said slowly, watching the way his stance shifted with each breath, "you're going to regret this." He leaned closer until his face hovered inches from hers. "I don't regret anything I do. I make people regret crossing me." The door rattled faintly in the wind outside. For a brief moment, his attention flicked toward the sound, and she took it. A quick step to the side, twisting her wrist the way Chuck had taught her years ago in a self-defense class. The movement broke his grip, but not his determination. He lunged, grabbing her again, this time by the shoulder. The impact slammed her back into the wall. The pain shot through her shoulder blade, but she didn't scream. Her silence unnerved him. He expected panic, pleading, the signs of submission he thrived on. Instead, she stared straight into his face, eyes unflinching. He sneered. "You think you're safe because of who your husband is? Out here, no one's watching. No one cares." "That's where you're wrong," she whispered. Miles away, Chuck was already on the road. The tires of his SUV hummed against the asphalt as he cut through the empty highway. His face was expressionless, but his hands were steady on the wheel. Years of training made his mind compartmentalize. Fear, anger, urgency, all filtered into clarity. The coordinates on his dashboard glowed red, leading him toward the North Shore Veterans Club. He knew every minute mattered, but rushing would only cloud his judgment. He'd been in enough real fights to know the difference between haste and precision. Inside the restroom, Hunt's tone changed. The confidence in his movements shifted into something meaner, more desperate. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about you. It's about people like you thinking you can run your mouths and get away with it." He pushed her again, and she hit the wall hard enough to make her shoulder throb. "You think you can humiliate me in front of my men and then walk away smiling?" Gina didn't answer. She was too busy counting breaths, waiting for the sound of the door. Chuck would come. He always did. He never promised to protect her because he didn't need to. He simply did it, quietly, effectively, like a law of nature. All she had to do was hold out until then. The fluorescent light above them flickered again, buzzing. It cast sharp shadows across Hunt's face, deepening the lines around his mouth, turning his features crueler. He started to say something else, but his words were drowned by the sudden roar of an engine outside. A low, familiar sound that made Gina's heart jolt. Hunt froze, frowning. "What was that?" She didn't answer. Instead, she straightened slowly, ignoring the pain in her arm. "You should let me go, Major." He laughed again, but there was hesitation now. "And why's that?" "Because you're about to make a very big mistake." He grabbed her by the collar, anger flaring back. "You don't tell me what?" A sound cut him off. The unmistakable slam of a car door, close enough that it echoed inside the restroom. His grip faltered slightly, his head turning toward the noise. Heavy footsteps crunched on gravel outside, unhurried, steady, deliberate. Hunt's eyes narrowed. "Who the hell is that?" Gina's lips curved faintly, the smallest trace of relief breaking through her composure. "My husband," she said. For a moment, Hunt didn't seem to understand. Then realization struck, followed by disbelief. "You called him?" he asked, voice sharp. "I didn't have to." The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Silence pressed in. The fluorescent light flickered again, once, twice. Then the handle began to turn. "Don't move," Hunt hissed, his hand tightening again around her wrist. "Don't even think about it." But Gina wasn't thinking about escape anymore. She was thinking about the sound of those calm, measured steps she'd known for 20 years. The kind that always arrived just before the world around her changed. The door creaked open. The faint smell of cold air rushed in. A tall figure filled the doorway, his face shadowed by the dim light from the parking lot. His voice, when it came, was quiet, almost too quiet to carry, but sharp enough to cut through the air like a blade. "Let go of my wife." Hunt's hand froze. The words hung in the stale air of the restroom, and for the first time that night, the Major's confidence began to crack. The silence that followed was heavy enough to make the flickering bulb above them sound like thunder. Hunt's hand tightened instinctively on Gina's wrist, though she could feel a subtle tremor running through his arm now. Chuck stood framed in the doorway, the dim yellow light of the parking lot spilling over his shoulders, outlining the calm strength in his stance. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of authority that never needed to be raised to be obeyed. "I said," he repeated slowly, "let go of my wife." Hunt hesitated, his brain stalling between recognition and disbelief. He had seen this man's face countless times, on television, in interviews, on the covers of martial arts magazines. But standing in front of him, in silence, without the filters of fame or lights, Chuck Norris didn't look like a celebrity. He looked like something infinitely more unsettling, a man who had already measured the situation, calculated the risk, and decided what would happen next. I don't think you understand," Hunt stammered, forcing a crooked smile that failed to mask the unease building behind it. "This isn't what it looks like." Chuck took one step into the room. His boots echoed on the tile. "It looks like you've been putting your hands on my wife." "It was a misunderstanding," Hunt insisted, releasing Gina's wrist as if to prove his point. "She overreacted, that's all. We were just talking." Gina moved to the side, rubbing her arm where the bruises were already forming beneath her sleeve. Chuck's gaze flicked to her, not to check for permission, but to reassure, and she gave him the faintest nod. She knew that look, controlled, calculating. It was the same expression she'd seen on him when he sparred with professional fighters or when he de-escalated dangerous situations in the years he'd spent training police officers. There was no rage in him, only focus. "Step away from her," Chuck said. Hunt exhaled a short laugh, masking fear with arrogance. "You can't just come barging in here and start throwing accusations. I'm a decorated officer, for God's sake." Chuck took another step forward, his shoulders relaxed, his movements almost slow. "Then act like one." The tension in the room coiled tighter, vibrating between the three of them. The smell of sweat and disinfectant thickened, and somewhere outside, the faint wail of a siren echoed in the distance, carried by the wind. Gina stood perfectly still, her mind caught between relief and the haunting knowledge that this confrontation was far from over. Hunt's pride couldn't accept silence. "You think you can scare me with your reputation?" he said, squaring his shoulders. "I've seen men like you. Tough guys who think a few black belts make them invincible." Chuck stopped 3 feet away from him, tilting his head slightly. "You've seen men like me," he said evenly, "but you've never met one." The Major's sneer wavered, but he pressed forward anyway, driven by the stubborn momentum of ego. "You're trespassing. I could have you arrested." "By whom?" Chuck asked, the faintest ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "You called the police?" Hunt didn't answer, and that silence told the truth. "Then they'll be here soon," Chuck said softly, "and they'll see exactly what kind of man you are." That was the moment Hunt snapped. His hand shot out, trying to shove Chuck back, but the movement was clumsy. The kind of attack made by someone used to intimidation, not actual combat. Chuck's body moved before the thought even registered. His left arm rose, deflecting the shove with a subtle parry, while his right hand captured Hunt's wrist and twisted with precise leverage. The Major grunted, his knees buckling as his own weight pulled him down. Chuck pivoted, guiding the motion, and a second later Hunt was on the cold tile floor, his arm immobilized, shoulder locked at a painful angle. Chuck didn't raise his voice. "If you move again, you'll break it yourself." Hunt froze, his breath hissing through clenched teeth. "You're assaulting a federal officer." "No," Chuck said, tightening his grip just enough to make the point clear. "I'm stopping one." Gina stepped forward slowly, her hands trembling, but her face composed. She looked down at the man who had spent the evening belittling her, his uniform now creased and dirty against the restroom floor. "You had every chance to walk away," she said quietly. "You chose not to." Her calm seemed to disturb Hunt more than Chuck's control. You think this will end well for you?" he spat. "Do you know who I am? Do you have any idea what I can—" The door burst open again before he could finish. Two police officers entered, weapons drawn but aimed low. Their lights swept across the room, freezing on the scene. The major pinned to the ground, Chuck Norris kneeling beside him, composed and utterly still. "Sir, please step back," one officer shouted. Chuck released Hunt immediately, raising his hand slightly. "I'm not resisting. My name's Chuck Norris. This man attacked my wife." Recognition flickered in the officer's eyes, but training held their professionalism. One of them helped Hunt to his feet while the other turned toward Gina. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "I am now," she said. The major tried to speak, but the officer silenced him with a firm hand. The story he was preparing to spin of misunderstanding, of exaggeration, died before it could begin. The bruises on Gina's wrist told enough, as did the frightened steadiness in her posture. "Sir," the first officer said to Chuck, "we'll need your statements." "Of course," he replied calmly. "We'll cooperate fully." As they escorted Hunt outside, Gina felt the tremor in her hands begin to subside. The adrenaline that had sustained her was giving way to exhaustion, the sharp edge of fear dulling into something colder, steadier. Chuck touched her arm lightly, his expression unreadable. "Are you hurt?" "Just bruises," she said. He didn't get the chance to do worse. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something like relief masked by restraint. "You did well," he murmured. "You kept calm." "I kept thinking of what you always say," she replied, voice low. "Control is everything." They stepped outside together. The parking lot was now alive with flashing lights, the sound of radios crackling in the dark. Hunt stood by one of the squad cars, shouting something unintelligible as officers restrained him. His voice was no longer commanding. It was desperate, angry, the kind of sound made by men who have finally realized they've lost. Gina looked at him for a long moment, her eyes unreadable. "Do you think he understands what just happened?" Chuck followed her gaze. "Not yet," he said quietly, "but he will." The officers approached again, taking statements, documenting injuries, marking the area with yellow tape. One of them apologized for the inconvenience, as if justice were something that could inconvenience. Gina nodded, polite but distant. When they were finally allowed to leave, she and Chuck walked toward his vehicle. The night had grown colder, the first hints of dawn beginning to paint the edges of the horizon. Inside the car, silence settled between them, not heavy but necessary. Gina leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes for the first time in hours. Chuck started the engine and glanced at her, his voice soft. "You did everything right." Her reply came in a whisper. "It doesn't feel right." "It will," he said, "once the truth does its work." As the car pulled away, the flashing red and blue lights faded into the distance. The city beyond the shoreline was beginning to wake, unaware of the storm that had quietly broken and passed within the span of an hour. In the rearview mirror, the North Shore Veterans Club stood silent once more, its banners still fluttering in the wind, as if nothing had happened there at all. But Gina knew better. She could still feel the echo of the major's hand on her wrist, the smell of disinfectant, the sound of her husband's voice cutting through the air like justice itself. The night had changed her, in a way she didn't yet have words for, but she knew it wasn't fear that lingered inside her now. It was something sharper, something that would not fade easily, a sense of certainty that she had looked cruelty in the eye and refused to bow. As the car disappeared down the long stretch of highway, the first rays of morning touched the horizon, and for the first time that night, Gina allowed herself to breathe. The danger was over. But the consequences had only just begun. For a moment the room froze, the air between them taut like a wire. Hunt's fingers were still locked around Gina's wrist, but his confidence was cracking. Chuck stood in the doorway, motionless, his eyes fixed on the major with the same quiet focus that could unnerve even the most disciplined fighter. The noise from the parking lot was gone now, swallowed by the thick silence that filled the narrow space. Only the hum of the flickering fluorescent light remained, buzzing faintly like a warning. Hunt finally spoke. though his voice sounded thinner than before. "You've got the wrong idea," he muttered. "We were just having a conversation." Chuck's gaze didn't waver. "Then release her." Something in the tone, calm, measured, absolute, made Hunt's jaw tighten. He hesitated for a moment too long, and in that instant, Gina's eyes met her husband's. There was no plea in her look, only trust. Chuck stepped forward once, slowly, his boots scuffing against the tile. Hunt flinched as though instinct told him he was no longer the one in control. "I said," Chuck repeated, his voice quieter now. "Let her go." Hunt's fingers loosened, releasing her wrist, but his pride refused to let him back down completely. "Look, this is ridiculous," he said, straightening his uniform as if that could restore his authority. "You barge in here making threats, and you don't even know what happened. Your wife—" "My wife," Chuck interrupted, the calm in his tone sharpening to something that made Hunt's throat go dry, "doesn't need to explain herself to anyone, least of all to a man who puts his hands on her." Hunt forced a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "So what? You're going to play the hero? This isn't one of your movies, Norris." Chuck's expression didn't change. "You're right," he said. "In my movies, I give people like you a warning first." That made Hunt snap. He lunged forward, fueled not by courage but by the desperation of a man whose ego couldn't survive being cornered. His right hand shot toward Chuck's chest, but it meant nothing. In the same instant, Chuck sidestepped, his left arm deflecting the strike. His right hand caught Hunt's wrist and twisted with controlled precision. The movement was fluid, efficient, honed by decades of real training, not choreography. Hunt's own momentum sent him sprawling forward, and Chuck guided him down with a subtle turn of his body, his weight pressing the Major's shoulder toward the ground. The sound of impact echoed across the tiled floor, followed by Hunt's strained gasp. Chuck stayed crouched beside him, one knee pressing lightly between the man's shoulder blades, his grip firm but not brutal. Hunt tried to twist, but the joint lock was perfect. One more inch of resistance and his shoulder would give out. "Don't move," Chuck said quietly. "You'll only make it worse." "You can't." Hunt's words broke into a grunt of pain as Chuck adjusted the angle slightly. Not enough to injure, but enough to remind him who controlled the situation. "I can," Chuck said. "And I am." Gina stood a few feet away, her breathing shallow but even. She wasn't afraid anymore. The sight before her was not about violence. It was about justice, delivered without rage or cruelty. Chuck's movements were clean, disciplined, stripped of any theatrics. He wasn't trying to humiliate Hunt, just stop him. "You know," Chuck said after a moment, "I served too. I know what that uniform should mean. You've disgraced it tonight." Hunt stopped struggling, the sound of his breath ragged. "You think you can judge me?" "I don't have to," Chuck replied. "You did that yourself." The sirens outside grew louder now, the red and blue lights cutting faint streaks across the frosted windows. Chuck slowly released the hold, rising to his feet while keeping his eyes on Hunt. The Major stayed down, one arm limp at his side, the other pressed against the floor for balance. "Stay there," Chuck said. "The police are almost here." Hunt's head snapped up. "The police? You called them?" "I didn't need to," Chuck answered. "The emergency signal on her phone did that for us." For a heartbeat, Hunt looked like he might try to get up again, but the weight of what was happening began to sink in. The flashing lights outside painted the walls in alternating red and blue as the sound of car doors slamming echoed through the night. Chuck didn't move. He watched as the door opened again and two officers entered, their hands instinctively resting near their holsters until they took in the scene. One of them recognized Chuck almost immediately. "Mr. Norris?" He nodded once. "This man assaulted my wife." The other officer knelt beside Hunt, who was trying to muster whatever authority he had left. "He's lying," Hunt snapped. "She twisted the story. She's exaggerating. This is—" "Enough," Gina said, her voice cutting cleanly through the chaos. "You dragged me here. You put your hands on me. The security cameras will show it." The officers exchanged a look. One of them stepped outside to radio dispatch, while the other began to read Hunt his rights. The Major's protests turned to incoherent mutters as they cuffed him, each word carrying less conviction than the one before. When they led him out, he glanced back over his shoulder. "You'll regret this," he hissed. You think this is over? Chuck's gaze followed him steadily. For you, it is. The door closed behind the officers, and for the first time since the night began, the room was still again. Gina exhaled, the tension draining from her shoulders. Chuck turned toward her, his expression softening. You all right? She nodded slowly. I am now. He stepped closer, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. The motion was tender, almost protective, but his voice remained steady. Let's get you home. Outside, the flashing lights cast their long shadows across the parking lot. The officers were putting Hunt into the back of a patrol car. He was shouting something about his service record, his connections, the people he knew who would fix this. But the noise faded as the car door slammed shut, leaving only the hum of the idling engines and the faint rustle of wind. Gina and Chuck walked toward their vehicle. Neither spoke until they were inside, the soft click of the door closing, sealing them in silence. He started the engine, the headlights cutting through the fog that had settled over the lot. I thought he was going to hit me, she said quietly. I know, he replied. You handled yourself well. I just kept thinking, if I panic, he wins. Chuck's eyes stayed on the road as they pulled away from the flashing lights. That's exactly right. For a while they said nothing more. The city lights appeared in the distance, blurred through the mist. Behind them, the Veterans Club was already returning to quiet, as if the night were erasing its own evidence. But the memory lingered, sharp and indelible, carried in the bruises on her arm and the steel in her voice. As they drove, Gina reached for his hand. You didn't even raise your voice, she murmured. He gave her a small, tired smile. Didn't need to. She looked out the window at the lights passing by, each one a brief, silent reminder that the world was still moving, still watching, even when no cameras were around. The night was ending, but both of them knew the story wasn't over. What had happened in that small, fluorescent room was only the beginning of a reckoning that neither of them could yet see in full. When the car finally merged onto the highway, the sirens were just a memory behind them, fading into the dark. Ahead lay the long stretch toward morning, the first faint line of dawn already hinting at the horizon. Gina leaned back in her seat, exhaustion washing over her. Chuck drove in silence, the road reflected in his calm, unblinking eyes. For him, the fight was over. For her, it had only just begun. The night after the incident stretched into dawn, with the weight of exhaustion and disbelief. By the time the first news vans arrived at the North Shore Veterans Club, the parking lot had already been sealed off with yellow tape. Reporters gathered outside the gates, their breath visible in the cold morning air, as cameras flashed and microphones jostled for position. Words like altercation, assault, and scandal began circulating before any official statement was made. The story, as such stories often do, had already outgrown the facts. Inside a quiet police station a few miles away, Gina sat in a chair facing a tired detective whose notebook was nearly full. She had given her statement 3 times, first to the responding officers, then to a supervisor, and finally here in the interview room. Each retelling was the same, each word measured. Her tone was calm, but behind her composure lived the tremor of something deeper. Anger controlled so tightly that it had hardened into resolve. Across the hallway, Chuck was speaking with another officer. His manner was as steady as ever, though the muscles in his jaw flexed every few minutes. The officer asked about the GPS alert, the timing, how he'd arrived so quickly. Chuck answered plainly, without embellishment, his voice low. My wife's phone is programmed to send me her location if she activates the emergency signal. I didn't call the police. Her phone did. The officer nodded, writing something down. Mr. Norris, I have to ask, when you confronted the suspect, did you use any excessive force? Chuck's eyes met his without hesitation. No, I restrained him until help arrived. That's consistent with the injuries we observed, the officer replied. No broken bones, just bruising on his shoulder. Then it was enough, Chuck said. When they left the station, the air was sharp and cold. Reporters were already outside, cameras turning toward them like mechanical predators scenting fresh movement. The flash bulbs ignited as the couple stepped into the light. Questions overlapped, voices rising. Mrs. Norris, are you pressing charges? Mr. Norris, was it self-defense? Is it true the attacker was an Army officer? Chuck raised a hand, and the noise softened slightly. His voice carried calm authority, the kind that demanded attention without force. "We've given our statements to the police," he said. "The rest will be handled by the law. That's all for now." They moved quickly to the car, ignoring the barrage of further questions. As the doors shut, the sounds outside muffled to a distant hum. Gina leaned her head against the window, her reflection pale in the morning light. "It's already everywhere," she murmured. "They'll twist it however they want." "Let them," Chuck said quietly. "The truth doesn't need defending. It just needs time." By midday, the first wave of headlines appeared online. Decorated officer arrested after assault on Chuck Norris's wife. Each article carried slightly different details, some accurate, others absurd. Within hours, Hunt's name was trending on social media. Former subordinates came forward with stories, small incidents of intimidation, rumors of disciplinary complaints that had been buried. The public's fascination grew, fueled by outrage and disbelief that a man celebrated as a veteran could harbor such darkness beneath his medals. That evening, Chuck and Gina returned to their home in Texas. The ranch was quiet, its solitude offering the first real relief since the night before. Gina sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the sunset smear gold across the sky. The bruises on her wrist had darkened, the purple fading into deep blue. She ran her fingers over them absently, as though testing whether the pain still belonged to her. Chuck joined her, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. He handed her one and sat beside her without a word. For a while they watched the horizon in silence. The cicadas had started their slow chorus, and the faint scent of hay drifted from the stables. "He'll lose everything," Gina said finally. "His career, his pension, his reputation." Chuck's gaze remained on the fading light. "He earned it," he said. "Every man pays for what he chooses to be." "I don't feel sorry for him," she said. "But I keep thinking how many others like him walk away without consequences." "That's what men like him count on," Chuck replied. "That no one will speak, that people are too afraid or too tired to fight." Gina took a slow sip of her coffee. "Maybe that's what scares them the most, that someone finally does." He looked at her, and there was something proud but weary in his expression. "You're stronger than you think." She smiled faintly. "Only because I had someone to teach me how to stand still when I want to run." The next morning brought the official statement from the military. Major Richard Hunt was suspended pending investigation, stripped of his command, and placed under review for previous complaints. The press framed it as justice served, but for Gina, it wasn't satisfaction that she felt, it was clarity. This wasn't about vengeance or fame. It was about exposing something small and cruel that had hidden behind uniforms and handshakes for too long. In the following days, the noise around them began to fade. Friends called, messages poured in, and offers for interviews came from every major network. Gina declined them all. "I don't want to be the story," she told Chuck. "I just want the truth to finish speaking for itself." At a small press conference outside their foundation's office, she finally spoke publicly, her voice calm and unwavering. "Violence doesn't begin with a strike," she said. "It begins with entitlement, the belief that someone's status or gender gives them permission to diminish others. I hope this case reminds people that silence isn't peace, it's complicity." Her words were broadcast across every channel that night, replayed in slow motion, quoted in newspapers, shared on social media. She didn't watch. Instead, she sat with Chuck on their porch again, the same quiet sky above them, the same field stretching endlessly into the dark. "They'll move on to another story soon," he said softly. "I know. And what then?" She smiled, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Then we keep doing what we always do. We get back to work." He nodded, reaching for her hand. For a long while they stayed there in silence, 2 figures outlined by moonlight in the distant hum of the world turning beyond their quiet corner of it. Justice, she realized, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it came quietly in the steadiness of a voice that refused to break, in the calm of a man who didn't need to shout to protect, and in the courage to confront the darkness that others pretended not to see. The consequences had arrived, not only for Hunt, but for every unspoken rule that had allowed him to act with impunity. And as the night deepened around them, Gina felt no triumph, only a deep, steady certainty. The storm had passed, but its echo would linger, reshaping everything it had touched. Morning crept softly over the Texas hills, spilling light across the wide porch of the Norris ranch. The fields beyond glowed in the early haze, the air still cool before the heat began to rise. Gina sat curled in a wicker chair with a mug of tea, her hair loose, her expression distant. The bruises on her arm had faded to yellow now, but they remained as quiet reminders of a night that had changed everything. Behind her, the wooden floor creaked under steady footsteps. Chuck came out, a worn jacket over his shoulders, the familiar calmness in his movements as he joined her. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Some," she said. "Not much. I kept hearing the sirens in my head." He nodded, lowering himself into the chair beside her. "That sound stays with you for a while, but it goes." The news had not gone. It had followed them across every channel and headline, across social media, across the invisible web of voices that thrived on outrage and curiosity. The story had taken a life of its own, painted with exaggerations, dissected by experts and strangers alike. Some called Gina brave, others questioned her motives, but none of it mattered. What mattered was that Hunt was in custody and would stand trial. The official report had come that morning. Chuck had read it silently before setting it aside on the table. Hunt was being charged with assault, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice. The military review had begun, and the man who once barked orders in uniform now sat in a holding cell waiting for a court date. Gina had not smiled when she heard. She only exhaled slowly, as if releasing the last piece of tension that had kept her upright for days. Now she sipped her tea, her voice soft. "Do you think people will actually remember why this happened? Not because of who I am, but because of what it means?" Chuck turned to her, studying her face in the morning light. "People remember the stories that make them uncomfortable. This one will stay. Maybe not for the reasons we want, but it will stay." She nodded slowly, thoughtful. "I keep thinking about how easily it could have gone differently. If my phone hadn't worked, if you hadn't come." He reached over and touched her hand, his calloused fingers warm around hers. "But it did work. You did everything right." "I wasn't brave," she whispered. "I was just angry. I've seen too many women stay quiet. I didn't want to be another name buried under someone's excuses." "That's not anger," he said. "That's courage that finally found its voice." A long pause stretched between them, filled only by the wind and the soft rustle of the horses in the stables. Chuck leaned back, gazing out over the fields. "Hunt will have a long time to think about what he's done," he said. "But that's his lesson, not yours." Gina smiled faintly. "You sound like you've been through this before." "I've seen what happens when men let power turn into pride," he said. "In the military, in training, even in the film industry. It's all the same disease thinking that respect can be demanded instead of earned." She turned her gaze to him. "And what cures it?" He thought for a moment. "Being reminded that there's always someone stronger. Sometimes that's physical. More often, it's moral." The screen door opened behind them, and the faint buzz of the television drifted out. A news anchor was reading the latest update. Major Hunt had officially been dishonorably discharged. The footage showed him being escorted into a courthouse, his head bowed, the glint of handcuffs catching the light. The caption beneath read, "Veteran officer faces justice after assault on activist." Gina watched only for a moment before looking away. "I don't want to see him anymore," she said. "Not on TV, not in my mind." Chuck muted the sound and let the door swing shut again. "Then don't. He's part of a story that's over." She looked at him. "Is it?" He smiled faintly. "For him, yes. For you, it's the beginning of something else." The next week moved quietly, the kind of quiet that heals. Letters began arriving at their foundation, hundreds of them from women and men who thanked Gina for speaking out, for standing her ground, for showing that dignity didn't mean silence. Some came from soldiers' wives, some from women who had endured harassment in workplaces, some from men who had watched and said nothing before deciding that silence no longer fit. Gina read each one carefully, folding them into a stack on her desk. One afternoon, she sat down to write a public statement. The words came slowly at first, then flowed with the steady rhythm of conviction. "What happened to me was not rare. What's rare is that people listened. For every woman who is silenced, There is a man who believes his title shields him from consequences. But the world is changing. Respect is not given by rank, and justice does not depend on who is watching. It begins when one person refuses to look away. When the statement went live, it spread faster than she expected. Invitations followed from news outlets, from advocacy groups, from universities asking her to speak about resilience and accountability. She accepted only a few. The rest she declined politely. "If I start chasing attention," she told Chuck, "then I'll become the story instead of the lesson." One evening they attended a small ceremony in Dallas where the governor presented Gina with a civic honor for courage and service. Cameras flashed as she stood at the podium, dressed simply in a dark suit, her voice calm as she spoke. "I'm not a hero," she said. "I'm someone who remembered what my husband always taught me. That discipline is not just for the body, it's for the soul. And the hardest fight we ever face is the one against indifference." The applause that followed was genuine, warm, and it filled the hall like sunlight breaking through a storm. Later, as they drove home under a velvet sky filled with stars, Gina leaned her head against the window and spoke softly. "Do you think we really changed anything?" Chuck's hands rested easily on the wheel. "Maybe not the world," he said, "but maybe the next woman who faces someone like him will think of you, and that'll be enough." When they reached the ranch, the porch light glowed like a beacon in the distance. They walked in silence through the cool night air. Inside, the house felt peaceful again, untouched by cameras or noise. Gina paused by the window, looking out toward the horizon. "You know," she said quietly, "it's strange. For so long I thought strength was about winning a fight, but it isn't. It's about choosing the fight that matters." Chuck came up behind her, resting a hand gently on her shoulder, and knowing when it's already won. They stood like that for a long time, the quiet settling around them like a blanket. Outside, the wind whispered through the fields, carrying with it the faint scent of cedar and earth. The world had gone still again, not because nothing was happening, but because, for once, justice had spoken loudly enough to let silence feel safe. The following morning brought no headlines, no calls, no cameras, only the soft hum of life returning to normal. Chuck was in the garage tinkering with an old motorcycle, his tools clinking rhythmically. Gina brought him coffee, watching him work in that slow, deliberate way of his. "So," she said lightly, "is this what peace looks like?" He looked up, smiling. "Something like it, until the next storm." She set the mug beside him, brushing a hand over his shoulder. "Then I hope we're ready." He met her gaze with quiet certainty. "We always are." Outside, the sun climbed higher, spilling light across the open land. The world beyond might still be chaotic, still imperfect, but here, in this place, balance had returned. Gina walked back toward the porch, her heart steady, her purpose clear. The silence that filled the air was no longer the echo of fear or pain. It was the sound of peace earned, the kind that only comes after the fight has already been won. If this story moved you, don't leave yet. There's more to come. Subscribe now to see the next stories where justice, courage, and fate collide in ways no one expects. Hit the bell so you don't miss the moment when truth strikes back again. Watch the next video right after this one, and share this story with someone who still believes silence means safety. The next chapter might change the way they see strength forever.